I've got a handout. I've only done 30, so you might have to share. And unfortunately, the Glyndebourne stapler kind of ran out of steam on the last two, so it's 5 pages. So when you get to the last stapled one, just count 5 pages for the next one. Maybe everyone can, and I'm happy to email it to you as well. But sorry, I can only do 30 because it was at work and they count the copies. So. Great, okay. In a published excerpt to a letter to Edith Bratt written on 2nd March 1916, the same month that she was to become Edith Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien commented, quote, "This miserable, drizzling afternoon, I've been reading up old military lecture notes again and getting bored with them after an hour and a half. I've done some touches to my nonsense fairy language to its improvement." March 1916 is an interesting month and year in the history of Tolkien's language invention linked to his poetic composition. One key project that we know Tolkien started work on at this time was his revisiting of 4 lines of poetry written in his nonsense fairy language of Qenya, the earliest form of his Elvish language, which sometime in November 1915 he had scribbled on the upper margin of the paper on which he composed the first version of his early elegiac world-building poem, Cortirion Among the Trees. In March 1916, Tolkien revisited these 4 lines and expanded it into a full poem, a version of which has been reproduced in the new edition of A Secret Vice, which co-edited by Dr. Davina Fahmy and myself. Tolkien's mentions of, quote, touches to my nonsense fairy language in his letter to Edith may have something to do with him inventing new base roots, attendant word forms, and grammatical structures for his composition of this new poem, which he called in Qenya Narquelion. In his 29th November 1931 talk on the art of language invention, A Secret Vice, we now know that's the date he first gave it, Tolkien would call poetry, quote, the final fruition of language development. And the fact that Tolkien was able to, only roughly a year since he started inventing it, compose a complete poem entirely in the Qenya language demonstrates the sophistication Tolkien achieved in his language invention in such a short time. Poetic expression linked to his language invention was a creative act that Tolkien had attempted several times before he started work on Qenya. In A Secret Vice, Tolkien related how he worked on his first known language, Nevbash, or the New Nonsense, with his cousin, and characterized it as, quote, it was good enough for letters and even bursts of doggerel song. The example he gives of this language is in the poetic form of a limerick, Dar Fis Ma Vel Gom Kop Hop Hop, which basically means there was an old man from, continue. Tolkien did not call the sample that he gives of his privately invented Nafran language poetic, but this enigmatic fragment he recites in A Secret Vice does seem to start off with an invocation, O Nafrinos, and at least the first 2 lines suggest a possible rhyming scheme, with the first line ending with Kangor and the second line ending with Tiranon. But we simply do not have enough of the Nafran fragment to be sure of this, and any attempted translation is risky at best. Also in A Secret Vice, Tolkien talks about the pleasure which might have been gained from the resplendent, lost Gothic poetry. And we know in about 1910, Tolkien was thinking of inventing a Germanic-inspired language called Gautisk, based on a proto-form of Gothic. Perhaps he would abuse this language invention to recapture this resplendent lost poetry, as he would do later when he composed poems like Dagme Bloma, Flowers of the Trees, in Gothic as part of the songs for the philologists. Tolkien wrote 2 key documents, the Qenya Lexicon and the Qenya Phonology, in which he outlined the phonetics, elements of grammar, and vocabulary of the Qenya language, which includes evidence of intended poetic uses. For example, in the Qenya Lexicon, Tolkien uses the notation of a dagger in the word list to signify poetic words, a convention Tolkien would have seen in many of the dictionaries and glossaries he was studying at the time. Secondly, there is a specific category of words in the Qenya lexicon that have a poetic, almost like song-like feel to them, which Tolkien builds from several base roots using the multiplicative prefix, the multiplying prefix, li or lin. And these are listed on your handout in number 1, called Intensifying Poetic Words in the Qenya Lexicon. From the prefix, and I did rehearse these last night very late, so. From the prefix, he constructs such poetic words as lint, tu, lu, si, a, lint, tut, la, si, a, meaning having many populars, the trees. Linta, sarindia, having many willows. Limp, pa, la, si, a, with much roaring. Lint, tulindoria, which means with many swallows congregating and singing at dawn, and this will later appear in the Narquelion poem. These tongue-twisting words specifically prefigure the same type of polysyllabic poetic words that Tolkien would give to his ancient tree herders, the Ents, in The Lord of the Rings, whose word for hill is, here we go, lala, lala, rumba, kamanda, lindor, borime. Say that 3 times quickly. And I've listed others here just so you can see. These types of poetic words not only intersect with Tolkien's poetry and language invention, but also reflect a key interest Tolkien had in both poetry and the making of art languages. And that is inventing words that would convey a sense without knowing the meaning of the word, where the sound sense of the abstracted word, not linked to meaning, conveys a poetic sound music. Tolkien's early reading of the Finnish Kalevala was an inspiration for this when he saw in the lines of this epic poem words that were included to add to the sound of the poetic line, what Tolkien in The Secret Vice called phonetic trills, and not have any real meaning. It was this, quote, merry freedom, as Tolkien characterized it, that he was looking to, in part, achieve in his poetic language invention. The emphasis on developing the sound system to create these types of words can also be seen in the section of Tolkien's The Qenya phonology called The Sounds of Qenya, which includes rules that focus on the system of accents and stresses of Qenya. In describing these, Tolkien uses such poetic terms as dactylic words and trochaic and spondaic positions. As Tolkien was developing this language, he was also engaging in his earliest world building. And given the evidence we have, the narrative form he chose to use in doing this is poetry, as can be attested in the earliest poem of the mythology, The Shores of Faery, from July 1915, and then works that followed, like Kor, Song of Eriador, and as I mentioned, Quarterion Among the Trees. Part of the reason for this was Tolkien was attempting to create a volume of poems based on his early mythology called The Trumpets of Faery, which he submitted for publishing to Sidgwick Jackson, but was unsuccessful in getting published before his active duty in World War I. And I am still on the hunt for the reader's report that turned down this work. I would suggest that another poetic impulse linked to language invention was Tolkien's intention to create versions of some of these poems in Qenya. In my thesis research, I noticed an interestingly high rate of occurrence of words in his mythic poetry of the time with either roots or words in the Qenya lexicon, and I refer you back to the handout. I give 2 examples of 2 early poems from this time. First, there's the short fairy poem Tin Fang Warble, and then the longer world-building poem from July 1915, The Shores of Faery, which is the first poem to have invented place names to signify Tolkien's emerging world-building, such as Valimar, Eldamar, and Taniquetil. As the data indicates, of the 31 words plus their modifiers in the short Tin Fang Warble poem, all but 2 have a direct or related word found in the Qenya lexicon, and you can go through it. In the case of the much longer The Shores of Faery poem, of the 109 analyzed word phrases, there is a Qenya root, word, or cognate for all but 13 of them, or an 88% frequency in terms of rates of words that would have had a Qenya source in the lexicon. What these 2 frequency analyses suggest is that Tolkien was inventing words in the Qenya lexicon that also appear in his English mythic poetry, suggesting that he was building this lexicon partially to serve as a collection of poetic words for parallel mythic expression in his invented languages. As his work on Quarterion Among the Trees inspired him to write the 4 embryonic lines of Qenya poetry, which would go on to become the first Elvish poem, Narquelion. So let's briefly return to this creative effort where language invention, myth, and poetry linked to evoking a word music fully meshed together. Tolkien's March 1960 poem, Narquelion. In the analysis of this poem in Vineyard Tangwar, Tolkien linguist Christopher Gilson states that for every word in the poem, there is a probable source that can be found in the Qenya lexicon. Either the word itself as an entry, or the word from which it's derived, or to which it seems closely related. Looking at your handout at the end, the last section, the name of the poem, Narquelion, derives from a base root in the Qenya lexicon, narquar, N-R-Q-R, meaning to wither, fade, or shrivel, and from which Tolkien constructed the word narquele, meaning a fading, withering, and the proper name Narquelion, meaning autumn, with the common I-O-N and genitive ending, so it literally means of the withering or of the fading. Therefore, through his base root language construction, Tolkien embeds in the morphological makeup of this Qenya word for autumn the very concept of the poem, and one of the key motives of his mythology, the act of withering and fading. This poem is an elegiac lament for the fading and loss of autumn and the coming of winter. The first two lines of Narquelion, which I've reproduced at the end of the handout, contains the poetic mention of two key elements in Tolkien's creative work, a tree and a leaf. In the first line of the poem, Tolkien's use of al-mino, elm tree, harkens to the lands of Al-Menore, in Tolkien's poem Quarterion Among the Trees, which derives from the base root in the Qenya lexicon, ala, A-L-A, which Tolkien suggests originally might have been used to indicate the spreading, possibly signifying things that spread out, and from which Tolkien constructed the related words alda, which means tree, al-alme, which means elm tree, and al-almenori, which in the Qenya lexicon Tolkien cites as, quote, land of elms, one of the provinces of Invention, in which is situate Quarterion, Warwickshire. From the tree falls leaves, lassa, which is found in the Qenya lexicon as lasse, leaf, with related words lasea, meaning with leaves, leafy, and lassilanta, the fall, autumn. The second part of which is seen in the final word of the first line of the poem on your handout, leilantila, of falling or dropping. Lassilanta is also cognate for the name of the poem Narquelion, autumn, when the leaves fall. The phonetic makeup of the Qenya words in Narquelion clearly shows Tolkien reflecting his thoughts on word, music, and sound sense. You don't necessarily have to understand the first two lines of the poem to get a sense of what is happening. The word form that exemplifies this the most is that last word on the first line, leilantila, whose invented syllable pattern conveys a sense of downward motion, leilantila, echoing the leaves falling from the tree. Therefore, what this evidence suggests is that poetry and song, linked not just to myth-making, but also to language invention, was at the heart of Tolkien's creative process from the very beginning, and that the poetic form was a key contributing factor to his invention of a language that would allow him to express his mythology in an art language that reflected his own personal sound aesthetic and was rooted in a complex and heavily structured system of grammar and morphology. Two key characteristics that Tolkien felt was important for invented languages to have. Tolkien concluded his talk of Secret Vice with the statement, quote, of course, if you construct your art language on chosen principles, and insofar as you fix it and courageously abide by your own rules, you may write a poetry of a sort. This poetry of a sort is evident in the poetry and song that shaped the earliest elements of Tolkien's world building, and would go on to become the body of eldest poetry of the great works to follow. The echoes of Narquelion can be heard in Galadriel's lament, Ai lari lanti lasti soinen yeni unto mebe rama eldaran. Thank you. Questions?
I guess I'll start then.
Yeah.
So you mentioned fading and the sense of downward motion in words describing autumn. Would it be true to say that Tolkien's invented languages in general have quite a minor tone that corresponds with a general idea of the receding and fading of his mythological world?
Well, there are words certainly that he invents that evoke that kind of sense. I mean, the whole sound symbolism and fun of aesthetics is very it's a tricky area because it's depending on who's listening to that. But one of the things that's used in phonology is that sense of what's called ablutes. When we say drink, drank, drunk, there's that idea that there's a downward motion to that. And I think that's what Tolkien's doing there. But you can go through the lexicon, and I think I once counted the number of words that have some relation to falling, going down, downward motion, and it's quite substantial. In all versions of his, every conceptual version of his language invention, which changes, a lot, there are always lots of words. I think in the Gnomish lexicon, there's over 15 different words to describe a downward motion, basically. And that would be an interesting question. Yes?
I'd like to ask something about the intellectual context of the time during which Tolkien composed his first versions of invented languages and poems in the early 20s,
yes.
Which is also foundational time for linguistics.
Oh, yes.
And a time when the relation between sound and meaning was being questioned with the Saussure credo that I don't know the words.
Signify. Yeah, it was
signified and signified was separate most of the time. And other linguists, and I'm thinking of Otto Jespersen, which is saying, well, perhaps not that much, and which who made much of phonistics at the time. So I'd like to hear about possible influence of that.
Dimitri and I are smiling at each other because we did a lot of work on this for Secret Vice. It was an amazing time because literally with modernism and things like that, there was this whole idea of moving away from Saussure's idea of the signifier and the signified, that this equals table, that kind of idea. Playing around with the word form, the sound, so you have people like Gertrude Stein, for example, which we did work on in the book, playing around with sounds of words without meaning, so a rose is a rose is a rose. You have James Joyce, of course, playing around with words and things like that. So this was a very, he was doing all of that in that early period when people started exploring that. And you have Jespersen, and you have the rise of invented languages and such. So there was a lot of stuff going on. We did some work on that for the Secret Vice book, and I think it's an area, and it's interesting, it's again about context, what was Tolkien doing in the context of what was going on around him. And I think there was so much work going on language and things like that fed in. And I think that whole sound symbolism especially was a key area. Yes, Dimitri.
Just to say, just a quick one, that it remained a heretical sort of idea. It still is a heretical idea, I suppose, but Saussure himself was interested in that phenomenon. There are notebooks where he's keeping lists of names and symbolic sort of, that it's not as clear-cut as, when we go back, we think of it as a big break, and it all changes after that. Saussure's brother was inventing a language as well. So,
And one of the first essays Tolkien ever wrote in his Exeter College notebooks was all about the use of the ablutes in Germanic language to create that idea of sound and stuff like that as well. That's in his Exeter notebook. So he was, that's earliest times for Tolkien, so he was very influenced by that. Yeah.